In this channel, Updating Research, I made videos describing how the governance of science by small self-selected groups too often creates a hostile environment for novel research. The videos focus on the past, reasons, evidence of it occurring today, and what can be done to help. In this and the next few videos, I will go over some real-life experiences of this inhibition, specifically within the computational and theoretical neuroscience community, which is my field that I studied for from multiple perspectives. You may not know this, but I have a degree in electrical engineering, computer science, a PhD in neuroscience, both working in a neuroscience lab and in a cognitive lab, and an MD. And just about every neuroscientist will agree that very little is currently understood computationally about how the brain recognizes information from its environments. Neurons of the brains are more connected and self-regulated than current computational models. But this is very important because if how information goes into the brain is not understood, how will anything else be understood? Like what the brain does with the information. The biggest gap in understanding involves feedback connections, where neurons project back to the neurons that activate them. However, most computational models of recognition do not incorporate this type of feedback at all during recognition. Briefly, in theoretical models, there are only a small number of connection types between neurons that process information. The simplest model is called feed-forward, where neurons directly activate neurons downstream, from inputs to outputs, by their connection strength. This is the basis of all the deep networks and machine learning models. I encourage you to take a look at my videos describing why these models are problematic as a model of the brain. The other model that is popular for brain computational theorists is lateral inhibition of neighbor neurons, which is feed-forward combined with side connections where neurons can inhibit other neurons in the same layer. Sometimes the inhibition is to the other neuron's inputs, but the key is they are not back to the same inputs that activate them. So it still inhibits the neighbors. The lateral inhibition, or inhibition of neighbors, makes sense in some cases, such as low-level vision, close to where information directly comes, for example, from the eyes, where edges and regions can be defined if one neuron inhibits its neighbor. And this type of inhibition is one account of circles of sensitivity that are seen in low-level regions. But when you start thinking of higher levels, where neuron represents more complex patterns, this can lead to a large number of connections and variables that don't make sense. For example, if there's a neuron representing a square and a neuron representing a diamond, well, they would have to be connected to each other. But then a neuron representing a hexagon pattern would have to connect to those other two, and any other pattern would also need to connect to the others. And so would the next, and so would the next, and next. And ultimately, there could be tens and thousands of representations where a neuron would need to connect to every other representation. And besides, what does a connection and amount of weight in that connection really mean in the high level? How much should neurons that represent scissors really inhibit the neurons that represent bell? And does that really mean anything useful for computation? So modelers that promote this narrative use what is called mean field models. They kind of address this problem by assuming that all connections are statistical. But this causes another problem where these types of models are no longer specific and are just an estimate of how a network might function. That approach loses both computational functionality and it doesn't really solve the problem of lateral connections. The other possible type of connection is presynaptic inhibition, and it is found throughout the brain, throughout the sensory recognition regions of the brain called the thalamus and cortex. So, for example, information will come from the eyes, and neurons will make a connection in the thalamus. And that thalamus projects to the cortex of the brain. And then the cortex feeds back to the thalamus, which then modulates those same neurons that feed up to the cortex. And you also see it within the cortex that neurons feed back and modulate the neurons that affect their inputs. You also see specialized neuron connections, like these trisynaptic connections, where information will activate the output neuron, but then feed back and modulate the neuron part that is activating that synapse. You also see other molecules that help regulate and provide feedback, such as nitric oxide. So some authors argue that there's more feedback than feed-forward connections because so much of the cortex of the brain feeds back to the lower regions and the inputs. And you see this in the sense of smell in olfaction. And it's really important in part because it doesn't have very good sense of space. So it's like purely recognition. And the olfactory bulb, which processes smell, is best understood because it can easily be cut off and studied. And it turns out that there's not only one circuit that feeds back to the inputs, there's two. So from the nose, the neurons will project to these glomeruli, which then make these loops that modulate the inputs coming in. But on top of that, the output from these glomeruli will then feed to the cortex itself through the connection to the olfactory bulb. And then what does the mighty cortex do? It turns around and feeds back to this little tiny olfactory bulb, which then modulates those inputs. So it's seen everywhere. And there's also evidence of the output neurons knowing about the input neurons if their activation changes over the long term. And this is the evidence of what's called homeostatic plasticity. So there's plenty of evidence of both anatomical and from recordings that there is this feedback back to the inputs and that the inputs are highly regulated. Feedback directly back to inputs is counterintuitive because the neurons ultimately shut off the inputs that activate them. But this can be done gradually over forwards and backwards iteration, setting up a tug of war situation between neurons that do recognition. Because it is counterintuitive, it's important to give talks and animations and simulations, even to academics. And this is why I was interested in the Worldwide Neuroscience Seminar series hosted by the University of Paris. They have a broad international audience of computational neuroscientists, and the website says this is a seminar dedicated to addressing theoretical issues in computation. But most computational theorists insist on discounting that these connections could be an integral part of recognition, as opposed to an afterthought about attention after going through feed-forward and lateral inhibition recognition models. Part of it is because these feedback connections are very difficult. They are very difficult to stabilize, difficult to analyze mathematically, and understand what may be going on. But that does not change the fact that the brain has them and that they're important. So I put suggestions through their web application and email directly suggesting giving a talk on this type of feedback model. And I did this for a year, about 5 suggestions in all. I also brought up the importance of this type of feedback in the questions and answers. The organizer asks that people send him a question in the chat before he lets them ask the question. But I found that my questions were chosen less and less. even after other speakers brought up that there are connections that are unaccounted for. So I finally asked the organizer, through these same texts during the conference, if they are purposefully ignoring my requests for an opportunity to speak. I also let them know that I have a channel about inhibition of research, where I will feature this specific example. Here is the answer directly. It seems like his actions were all intentional without having a conversation of why and how such a talk could be incorporated, and concern of how to move the field forward. The organizers have simply ignored all communications without a reason or suggestion. You would think this is preposterous, that academics would not want to discuss new ideas, especially since a talk does not mark a commitment or agreement. It's just a discussion. In fact, a talk with disagreement about what is the best way may be the most stimulating and interesting for research. Despite creating the videos about academic behavior that discourages novelty, I still have a hard time believing that even today academics would want to do that. But here you have it, folks. Videos on the real academic situation. If you like this content, like and subscribe, and I will produce more, some of which will be very surprising, as this is not an isolated example. Thank you, and stay tuned.